Welcome back to another exciting edition of Western Civilization 1. Today we're going to be looking at Roman expansion. We'll see Rome grow from a city-state into an Italian-wide power. The focus question is going to be Rome developed a flexible and pragmatic approach to both its citizens and people it conquered. How did this serve Rome well? So essentially we're going to see Rome is very flexible with how they govern, and they're going to pretty much stick to what works. That's what pragmatic means. We're going to see how they're able to do this and how it works very successfully for them. So grab a pen and paper, a laptop and keyboard, and let's get going. The first thing we want to start with today is talking about the Roman orders. What's an order, you may ask? Well, it's kind of like a caste, or a class, I guess you could call it. An order was a group that people were born into in early Rome, and they're pretty much stuck in it. In early Rome, if you were a citizen anyways, you were born into one of two castes. Orders, a patrician or a plebeian. For those of you familiar with India, India has what's called a caste system. You're born into a group. And so it's different than a class because you can either make more or less money, but when you're stuck in an order or a caste, you're pretty much stuck there for life. Well, anyways, the two groups in Roman society were the patricians. The patricians made up a relatively small percentage of the population. They were the dominant order. They monopolized all of the high government positions. They tended to be wealthier. According to legend, the patricians were the descendants of the first 100 families that Romulus, the founder of Rome, had chosen for the Senate. And so they really represented the dominant order in Roman society. The other group were the plebeians, and the plebeians were basically everything the patricians were not. They made up the majority of the population. Some estimates are about 95%. They tended to be poorer, although not always. There were rich plebeians, and so it wasn't a class thing, it was an order thing. But they made up the majority of the population, and they were regarded as legally and socially inferior. They were excluded from the governance and all of the high positions. And as you can imagine, the plebeians weren't happy about their lot in life. And initially, the patricians disregarded their complaints. But over the course of, about a 250-year period, roughly from 494 to 287, according to Roman historians, the plebes seceded. In other words, they went on strike. Said, well, you try running a city without 95% of your population. See how well it goes when you're attacked. And so the plebes got up and left and supposedly went to a nearby hill and carried on business until the patricians came to their senses. And to their credit, the patricians did. They said, oh, okay, what do you want? And they made concessions. And according to history, the plebes had to do this several times until they were satisfied with what they got. Now, it's important to remember that if you were a wealthy plebe, you probably had different concerns than a lower class plebe, and so we'll deal with each of these in turn. The number one concern for the lower class plebes was land. They were poor, and the way to wealth in ancient Rome was through land. And so the patricians said, okay, whenever we conquer some new land, we will give part of it to the plebes. so that way they can have their own farms and become wealthy, respectable members of society. Another one of their concerns was that magistrates would often abuse them. And so there wasn't any law against it, and so one of the things they wanted was written laws, and that was another thing that they got. But they also wanted some protections in government. And so a really important new magistrate office was created for them. And this magistrate was called the Tribune of the Plebes. And this gave the lower class plebes some real political power. Because what the Tribune had the power to do was to call an assembly of the plebes. And any decision that the plebes came to would become Roman law, binding on everybody, including the patricians. And so the plebe was kind of like a plebeian council, if you want to think of it. They couldn't lead an army, but they could call an assembly. They were also given the power of the veto. So if a law was on the books or a law was passed that the plebes felt was damaging to them, prejudicial toward them, the tribune could strike down these laws. And so with these concessions, the lower class plebes felt that they were adequately represented by Rome and largely satisfied. Now upper class plebes, they were a different story. They already had money, they already had wealth and power, and they weren't really too concerned about any of these things. But what they wanted was they wanted access to the highest offices of government, something that they were prohibited from. And so, through the sessions, various reforms were made, and one of the things that they got was they got the right to marry patricians. Prior to this time, they were barred from this. Marriage between a patrician and plebe were barred. And so one of the things that they got was they got the right to marry into the patricians, which was good for them. If a child was born, it would take on the status of the father. The Romans were patrilineal. They traced descent through the father. And so if a patrician man married a plebeian woman, their descendant would be a patrician. In addition to this, the plebes got the right to high office. You remember the magistracies, there were always colleagues. And so a law was passed that every single time there was an election, one of the consuls would have to be a plebe and the other half would be a patrician. Same thing with the praetors, the aediles, and all of the other magistracies. So roughly half of the offices would automatically go to plebes. In time, this would mean that the Senate would become half plebeian, and the plebeians would become members of the ruling class. And in time, this division between patrician and plebe became really inconsequential. The new ruling class that was formed was one based off of wealth, and in time these divisions really became meaningless and everybody was happy, and so the plebes were brought into the ruling class, and Rome was now prepared to take on the world, having settled things at home. Well, it's important now, as we move and talk about Rome and its expansion, to look a little at its military culture. The Romans were a very militaristic group of people. The Roman elite, now comprised of plebe and patrician, the Roman elite prided itself on military virtues. As a matter of fact, the word virtue is a Latin word and comes from the word manliness. And so these manly, militaristic virtues were at the heart of Roman society. And one way to show off your bravery was through war, either through commanding or fighting in war. And so the Romans developed this culture. And a big aspect of the Roman military ethos was to never give up. They were dogged. The Romans lost battles, but they never lost wars. They just would not give up. And this is one of the characteristics that would enable them to take over the world. And it should be said that war was lucrative. We're going to see that the Romans pretty much are at war almost continuously. And so there was always plenty of opportunity for plunder. When you would sack a city, the plunder would be divided among the army, the general and his troops, and so this was a very lucrative thing for Rome. Also, it meant opportunities for new lands, something that all classes of Rome could get behind. Now, one of the interesting aspects of Rome is that its soldiers were not professional. They were citizen soldiers. When a new consul would be elected, one of his first activities would be to gather together the citizens who were eligible for recruitment and to select his army. These citizens were normally farmers or did something else, and they would be recruited into the army. And they were amateurs. They were volunteers. You didn't get paid as a Roman soldier, or you were given very little. Now, we shouldn't construe this amateur nature of its army to mean that Rome wasn't well trained. It was a very well trained, especially the most effective army of the ancient world. But Rome, its government, had a pretty small budget. It didn't need one. The citizens were divided into groups, depending on your ability to bear arms. And so there were 5 divisions in Rome, depending on your class. The uppermost division would have to contribute a horse because they had the ability to do so. The middling groups would be expected to provide their own armor. The state did not provide you with armor or weapons. You brought that on your own. And the poorest members of society were largely excluded from service because they couldn't afford the armor. These soldiers would serve with little or no pay. They would mostly live off the land, and generally campaigning season lasted a couple of months, and then after it was done, you went back to your farm, hopefully laden with some spoils from a nearby city that you had sacked. And so this was essentially the Roman army. Well, with this army, this military culture, Rome began to expand. By 500 BC, Rome was essentially just a small city-state on the Tiber. But in time, they were able to dominate and subjugate their nearby neighbors, the Latins, becoming the leaders of what they called the Latin League. But of course, expansion only meant that you had new neighbors. And so Rome launched a series of wars, very vicious wars, I should mention, hard fought against their neighbors, the Samnites, 2 groups of wars. And by 290 BC, the Romans had subjugated all of central Italy. Well, of course, now you have new neighbors and new conflicts arose. And so the Romans launched a series of wars against their southern neighbors, the Greeks, and they were successful by 272 BC. Now, part of Rome's strategy for dealing with peoples that they had conquered was to send out colonia, or colonies as we would call them. And colonies were an effective tool on the part of the Romans, and they served a variety of functions. For one, the colonies they sent out would be mostly poor people, people who had been promised land by their agreement, and this would enable these Roman citizens who were poor and destitute to go out and begin to farm these new lands, because when Rome would conquer someone, they would demand lands. This gave these poor citizens now the ability to afford armor, and so it increased the size of the Roman army, got rid of potentially poor, troubled elements in Rome itself. and so that was good. And it put Roman soldiers, Roman feet, down into hostile territories, right? So this is land they had just subjugated. And now you had Roman citizens, and they could act as a watchdog on the locals to make sure they weren't up to trouble or rebellion. This also had the added benefit of spreading Roman culture and the Latin language across the peninsula. Now, subjugated people were automatically enrolled as allies. And I put allies in quotations because, well, they were kind of forced into this. Upon defeat, Rome would bind people into a perpetual treaty of alliance. So they would be forced into being allies. Essentially, this meant that you would have to have the same friends as Rome and the same enemies. If Rome had an enemy, they automatically now became your enemy too. And Rome essentially controlled the foreign policy of all of these territories and cities that it had conquered. Part of the deal was that you were also required to send soldiers to the Roman army. When the Romans would go out, typically half of their army would be Roman, and the other half would be comprised of its allies, always under the command of a Roman. And allies were also entitled to some of the spoils, so it was lucrative for them too. And so Rome, really, if you looked at Italy in these early decades, it was just a patchwork of Roman colonies, Roman territories, and Roman allies. And this proved to serve the Romans very well because this enabled them to have a gigantic army. Really, if you think about it, all of Italy was fighting now on behalf of the Romans. And they're ruled pretty lightly. As I said, the Romans didn't have a big budget. They didn't have a bureaucracy, and they didn't try to manage and micromanage the lives of the cities that they conquered. Other than forcing defeated people to give up land and to send in soldiers, Rome didn't ask for very much. In a sense, there was no tax. They paid a blood tax, if you want to think about it, by sending their young men to fight for Rome. But other than that, there was really no tax that Rome demanded. The cities were left essentially alone. They had their own elite and continued very much like they had before. They would have their own elections and their own magistrates and their own senate and pretty much be left alone. They could keep their own laws, they could keep their own coinage, religion, and their own language. And many, in fact, grew to like life under Rome. Rome didn't ask for much. It liberated these cities from fear of invasion. Rome would provide protection for them. And in time, many of these cities, their elites, would intermarry with Roman elites and essentially become part of the Roman system. And so if you were to look at the Roman Empire at this time, really there was the city of Rome, and it was in alliance with a bunch of other different cities. There was no bureaucracy, there was no Roman control over these cities, other than the fact that you now had Roman citizens plopped down among them in colonies, and they were required to send troops to Rome. Okay. What I'd like you to do now is to get your notes together and answer this question. Rome developed a flexible, pragmatic approach to both its citizens and the people it conquered. The Romans were flexible and pretty much did what worked. How did this serve the Romans well?